any delay, we will hear now Dr. Oded Steinberg, who is an historian on European nationalism. He holds a PhD from Oxford University about Anglo-German intellectuals and the perception of these topics. And tonight he will speak about current and historical European responses to suffering and atrocities.
And the most important thing is the quote from Bridge Over Troubled
Water. And I think we're going to hear a lot about Armenia.
Yeah,
right?
Not about Simon and Garfunkel. Not
okay.
Today.
Please, Oded.
That's not my other. Okay, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. It's okay, Elisheva? Okay, sure. Let me just put my timer on. So, today I'm going to speak basically on my next project, which after concluding my book, basically, and I'll speak about this very interesting picture in a second. Actually, it's not a photograph, it's a picture, it's a painting. I'll do it with that for a minute, but today I'm going to speak basically about my next project. And after concluding my book, Race, Nation, History, Anglo-German Thought in the Victorian Era, which you can see the cover here, it's forthcoming in the University of Pennsylvania Press in June 2019, I commenced with a new research project, I would say, that could be summarized as Britain's response toward the suffering of the Armenian communities living under Ottoman rule in the end of the 19th century. Now, at the heart of this project, I would say, I identify a very crucial discourse that is still very much relevant, I would say, and very much happening now, to the current European sphere. I mean, how transnational European-based networks, agencies, and communities react to recent and ongoing suffering of various non-European communities, I would say, especially from Africa and the Middle East. But before probing into a current example, I would say, and then delving into the main historical case, I wish to shortly elaborate on the key themes and concepts that delineate my work. As a scholar of European studies, as a historian, and specializing on intellectual history and nationalism. Now, one major facet of my work is the development of ideas in the European transnational arena. Now, in my book, I focused on how racial ideas of Teutonic Germanic affinity had been actually transferred among a network of German and English scholars during the second half of the 19th century. This involves questions of nationalism, identity, race, and so on, and especially periodization, how we perceive time, how they perceive time. Now, my interest in the movement and development of, I would say, of ideas in the European transnational arena will also be demonstrated today when I will focus on a certain transnational network that had attempted to aid the suffering Armenians during the end of the 19th century. Now, this also deals with the discourse about activists beyond borders, which is a very famous book in the social sciences, and I really depended on it when trying to observe this transnational network. Now, another very important notion I'm occupied with in my studies in general, not only today in this topic, is the merging of ideas and emotions. How do they overlap? I mean, how do they are different? How are they detached? And as I will show today, how in certain cases, values, ideas, and emotions enter the discourse of interest into the realpolitik. How do they affect their realpolitik? Now, finally, as will be exemplified later, I'm interested in studying the voices that mainly emerge among the middle spheres. By this, I mean the voices that emerge from the middle classes, and not necessarily among the elites or the lower classes. I will later explain this notion in greater depth, but I want to specify now that I see these middle voices, if you want, as the hub for the humanitarian or emergence of humanitarian aid in cases of suffering and persecutions. And this is a very important point. Now, at this stage, I want to present, I would say, a current case, happening actually as we speak, in the Netherlands, in Holland. And it's concerning the activity of a certain Christian humanitarian network. Now, this case will then lead me to what I see as my major next project, the next book, basically, I've already written 2 articles about this Armenian network, Philo-Armenian network, but my book is going to see this also in the scope of international, or I would say European networks of affinity. Now, it has long been argued by various scholars that the way we receive and respond to images and reports of suffering is linked to a certain ethical, psychological, cultural, political, and historical paradigms. Each one of us, depending on the former paradigms, constructs a certain, I would say, emotional and moral scale that could be named as the hierarchy of suffering. Now, this hierarchy, I would say, which can be attested in various religious and cultures, for instance, in Judaism, Aniyei Chakodmim, which is a very kind of strong statement, I would say, is a key to understanding how certain states and communities, as well as individuals, react to atrocities and persecutions. Why is it then in some cases there seems to be a great public outcry, which could also lead to harsh diplomatic and even, I would say, military response, while in other cases the suffering appears only as news item that fades away relatively quickly? Now, as we speak now, and for the last 90 and so days, and this all started in October 26 at 1:30 p.m., a small Protestant church at the city of Hague in the Netherlands is conducting an unending service. They pray all the time, literally. Now, the service held in turn by a group of 650 pastors and volunteers from the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Belgium. So this is a transnational European network of volunteering of pastors and so on, are actually praying for the safehood, I would say, of the Tamarzian family, which is an Armenian family which is seeking for refuge in the Netherlands. Now, the story is this. The family took refuge in 2009 after fleeing Armenia due to political persecutions. Now, according to a still valid, and this is a very interesting response of how we treat the past as well, but a still valid law, a medieval law, by the way, the police cannot enter the church while there's a prayer taking place inside the church. So basically, they cannot take the refugees, the Tamarzian family, outside from the church, and basically deport them outside from the Netherlands. Now, currently, this religious humanitarian act has received a great public and media attention. There are major and heightened debates in the Netherlands concerning the fate of the family. Over 2,100 people signed a petition in support of the family, and concerning this matter in the context of the whole migration policy, especially in the Netherlands, the main coalition party is being held under great pressure. Now, the whole incident, therefore, I would say, which is infused with ethical, of course, and emotional meanings, has become an affair with possible acute political implications as well. Thus, it is being immersed with a discourse of interest. It's becoming a political debate as well. Now, the debates also include discussions, and this is a very important point regarding the place of the church in Europe today, about the role of the church in the 21st century. After years of decline, and one could say in the stature of the church, in the Netherlands as well as in the whole of Europe, the response of this small Protestant church amplifies perhaps a different path that churches all around Europe should take in response to such incidents of persecution and suffering. Perhaps they should act, show empathy, sympathy, and be more, I would say, involved in current affairs. Instead of aligning with the official government line, churches, similar to some NGOs, should adopt affirmative action against certain policies, especially in order to counter, I would say, the growing xenophobia of populist regimes and parties around Europe. But I would say beyond the potential role of various European churches from all dominions in countering anti-migrant and racist discourse, the Tamarzian incident points to another relevant issue, which was mentioned before and will be in the heart of my discussion today. It underscores how some cases of suffering receive special treatment and response, while others are quickly forgotten or even passed unnoticed. In this case, it is without a doubt that the act of unending service that caught the media as well as the public eye is the major thing here. This is what worked for them. But why did this Protestant church decide to act in this manner from the first place? What was its goal and so on? Here we come again to what was named as the hierarchy of suffering, a concept that implies more than sheer emotions. Perhaps the church acted in the first place since the Tamarzian family is Christian. And this is the heart of the matter. As Theo Hetman, you can see the quote here, he just quoted this 3 days ago, and said and declared, just before Christmas, when we celebrate God's humanity-loving and peaceful deeds, we feel strengthened not to forsake our responsibility for the Tamarzian family. Hence, a certain religious, cultural paradigm moved the Tamarzian family up the hierarchy of suffering. Now, this, of course, is not a criticism against the church, nor does it mean that the church only supports this specific church, Christians, while ignoring the suffering of others, non-Muslims, for instance. Naturally, there are plenty of European agencies, including churches, of course, that support Muslim refugees. My point, following my preliminary comment, is that most of us seem to follow certain paradigms, which contain more than only feelings or emotions that regulate our own hierarchy of suffering, basically. Now, I want to delve basically into the heart of the matter. This is my next book. I've written 2 articles about this. This is an evolution from my first book. And it's about, what we say, a historical case. It's the end of the 19th century. It's basically how Britain treats the Armenian communities in Armenia. The suffering of the Armenians in the end of the 19th century, basically. Now, this will also lead, and I would say there's a lot of correlations here, especially concerning the response of suffering to non-Christian communities. And this is a very kind of similar discourse going on here. Now, I want to illustrate now that the contemporary dilemmas and notion concerning, I would say, the European response towards anguish and the distress of non-Europeans have this similar precedents in history. Now, one such is, of course, this Armenian case and the response of Britain towards the suffering of Armenians in Asia Minor. There, by the way, you can see a map of the 6 provinces in Armenia. It says down here in German, Verteilung der armenischen Bevölkerung. This was done in 1896, basically, by a German who was an activist for the Armenians. Now, this, I think, historical case study emphasizes my earlier point regarding the hierarchy of suffering, and also illustrate how ideas and emotions and values enter the discourse about interests into the realpolitik. Now, the June 2016 German Bundestag acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide and the 2015 events marking the genocide centenary signify a growing awareness of what many scholars define as the first genocide of the 20th century. Now, while attention is being given to the atrocities of 1915, of course, the famous genocide, there's a certain growing yet not sufficient scholarly interest in the Armenian massacres of 1894-97, and to the whole subject of the Armenian question, as well as the Eastern question, which I'll explain in a second what the Eastern question or Armenian question is. Now, in the heart of the Armenian question, there's, I would say, caring for the well-being of the Armenian Christians living under Ottoman rule. And this is a major issue that develops in the end of the 19th century, and this evolves also the Eastern question, which is basically the European powers' struggle and bickering over the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is the height of the situation at the end of the 19th century. There are vast massacres of Armenians in the Asia Minor. And according to some estimates, more than 100,000 Armenians, this is the highest number of victims in the 19th century. One has to understand this. Perished during these massacres. Now, in many ways, they were a continuation of a long Ottoman oppression against the Armenians. Already in the 1870s, and in relation to the Russia-Turkish War of 1877, 1878, the Armenians suffered from persecutions. And in response to their continuous anguish, and this is the main point I want to make today, many Christian individuals and organizations, this is also related to the Marzian incident today, mobilize and operate for the survival and welfare of the Armenian communities. Now, for these Christian individuals and organizations, the Armenians were the bulwark of Christianity and were in desperate and existential need of Christian aid. The Armenians hence were imagined, that is a very important point also in nationalism, they were imagined as being affiliated to a greater Christian unity, as part of a Christian unity. Now, due to time limitations, I know I have only another 15 minutes, I cannot present the full complexity of the Armenian question. It's a very complex, and I will be happy, and this I wrote before, I will be happy to take more questions in the Q&A. But for now, I will mainly stress that Britain, there were 2 main camps. One camp which included many affiliates of the Liberal Party, headed by Gladstone, the Prime Minister, aimed to support the Armenians and act against the Ottoman oppression and empire. The other, and this is very crude division, the other mainly linked to the Conservative Party and to the leader Benjamin Disraeli, of course Prime Minister, wished to maintain the historical alliance with the Ottoman Empire. Now, since the late 1870s, and here you can see a caricature from the Punch, basically. The Israeli is a sphinx. There's a graffiti here saying the Eastern question, and then all the people are basically asking, do act for our Christian Armenians and Christian sufferings under Ottoman rule. Now, since the 1870s, and especially during the massacres of 1894-97, the British public protested harshly against the Ottoman treatment of the Armenians. One Prime Minister, and I mentioned it before, William Gladstone, was considered to be the protector of the Christian communities, including the Armenians. Now, this pro-Armenian stance, I would say, it must be noted, and this is very important again to the point I made regarding emotions into the realpolitik, how they merge and so on, influence politics. And it assisted Gladstone to win the elections of 1880 because he was the protector of the Christians. Now, a decade and so later, the Liberal Lord Rosebery, who replaced Gladstone as Prime Minister in 1894, had to resign from office due to the eruption of the early Armenian massacre in the summer of 94. Thus, in the case of the Armenian question, emotions, ideas, and values, referring to the point I made at the beginning, influenced the political arena and intermingled with the discourse of interests. Now, to end this very brief historical background, it is important to note that despite the public outcry and the political effects of the Armenian question, here we see like the long durée of how interests and emotions work, both the liberal and conservative parties and governments continued to support the Ottoman Empire. So it was an interest, but not an interest as important as a vested interest. And they both basically preserved this British Empire's interest. And I could really go on this. I will happy to relate to this later on. It's a very complex issue, but the main points I think are being made here. Now, this is the heart of the research. Now, the majority of research relating to the Armenian massacres of the 19th century focus on a certain political, diplomatic issues associated with the Eastern question that I mentioned before. But little work has been devoted to the question of how transnational networks, and this is also relevant, very much relevant to our understanding of Europe today, that mainly represent these voices of the middle sphere. How this church in the Netherlands started acting. How did it merge a certain, or I would say, start to build a certain transnational network. My project, however, focused on the study of one such transnational Philo-Armenian network. This network, mainly based in Britain, seemed to express various emotions of empathy, sympathy, hate and pain toward the predicament of the anguishing Armenians. And this transnational network, I would say, and you can see it here, these are the names of the network, by the way. This is one example of a letter, but I'm working on thousands and thousands of these things. Basically, letters of the Philo-Armenian network. This is my next book. And here you can see the whole network's named. So it involves Armenian people living in the diaspora, merchants and so on, missionaries, humanitarian activists, all of them from that middle sphere that I just spoke about. Basically, the voices of the middle sphere. Now, this transnational network, and here you can see a picture of Europe. Of course, America is not in Europe, so Alice Blackwood, the famous suffrage and women activist, is not here, but she's in America. So there's a whole kind of global even network. And this is James Rice. This is a group of the Armenian merchants. This is Jescherez, a French scholar, and this is Steiner, which is which is a German activist, a humanitarian activist. So this Philo-Armenian, I would say, network seemed to retain a certain Christian pan-Christian identity. The vocations of the network, of course, as I mentioned, are basic from the middle class. And what's important to know that some of the community's members were indeed direct eyewitnesses of Armenian suffering. However, most of its members were not first-hand witnesses. This is an important point also regarding suffering abroad, and could only identify as distant sympathizers of a certain suffering of the Armenian cause. Now, this Armenian network, and this is also a very important point, aimed to bridge the gap, I would say, between the distant Armenians and the British public. and politicians through the expression of different Christian emotions. Hence, despite some dogmatic, nationalistic, social and cultural differences between the Armenians and the British public, they were again imagined as belonging to a certain Christian community. Here, therefore, we are presented with a clear case which, through what could be referred to as emotional Christianity, there was an attempt to upgrade the Armenians in the hierarchy of suffering. Again, moving them up the scale. Now, let me now present, and you can see here, by the way, Gladstone and Lord Argyll dressed as crusaders going, if you talked about Huntington before, so this is a clear clash of civilizations. This is how they view this. Now let me now present a few examples. Here you can see Gladstone, by the way. From the network's vast, very vast correspondence, I can only give you three. I mean, I have 10 minutes, so I can only give you 3 examples, short ones. But I'm working on a whole archive here, so that's the point of the research, basically. Now, hatred of other religions, in this case mainly toward Islam, was a rather dominant emotion among the network's members. Consider, for instance, what this is a merchant, middle-class merchant from Manchester, he's telling Bryce is a champion of the Armenians in that time. I could understand the Beacon's Fenian politic, who still is narrow-born Cyril Jew, by the way, Judeo-Christian and so on. Here we have Judeo-Islamic. This is a very important twist. Perhaps of Islam too. But I could never dream that the Gladstonian, I mean the English, real English politics, that Jew is not English, that's what he refers to, this Armenian merchant, would be perhaps worse. Now, the identification, of course, of the Israeli Jewish roots, and the Israeli, this is a very important kind of saying, defined himself as the, I would say, the white page, this is his own definition, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So basically, because he's a converted Jew, I mean his father is a converted Jew, so he's the white page between these two. By the way, Judeo-Christian discussion. So this is to suggest that the Israeli and all other English Jews are not loyal to England, but rather to their innate Semitic roots, Asian roots. The feeling rather than emotion of Christian neglect, and this is very important here, betrayal, or of Christian betrayal, you could say, is also very kind of emerges here. And for Baron Jan, this merchant, as well as for many other members of his network, neglect is tightly linked to English betrayal of Christian obligations, against Christian obligations. Now there's another Mancunian, you know all what Mancunian is, of course. Mancunian is a dweller of Manchester, basically. So another Mancunian Armenian by the name of Papassian, he told Bryce how very heartbreaking, again, it is to witness the extermination of your countrymen, and how very painful becomes that grief when we find ourselves left alone to our fate by Great Britain, who we loved so much. Again, you see the heartbroken of the Armenian community living in Britain. Now, pain indeed is an emotion, or important emotion, in the context of this project, this book. Now, many of the community's members of this transnational network, basically, refer both to their own pain as witnesses, of course, but also to the pain of the victims, of course, the Armenian victims. Now, Papassian is a witness to the atrocities. He conveyed his own severe mental, as you can see, and physical pain. There is a sense in which, following certain experiences, the witness himself, and this is an important point, becomes a victim. In case of individuals like Papassian, it could be argued that his sympathy was a consequence of his own Armenian identity. Thus, Papassian's emotional expressions were mainly determined by national or ethnic affinity, less by religion perhaps. But I would claim that these nationalistic or ethnic identities were less relevant for the whole Philo-Armenian context or network. For Bryce, Stevenson, and all the Americans and Germans working in this. For them, it was mainly about the suffering of other Christians by the hands of Islam. The notion of Christian suffering and even martyrdom links the Armenians, and this is an important historical chain to understand how they view the world. Of course, this is all about images of Islam. I'm not saying this is Islam, of course, or this is Christianity. This is images, interpretations of Islam. Now, the Armenians are basically the early Christians of pagan Rome, and they died for their faith. I cannot read the whole quote, but Bryce stated this in a parliament session in 1896, and I have, I would say, hundreds and hundreds of these discussions. Now, what's important, that during the massacres in 1894, 97, there were 1,500 articles written on the Armenian question. So this is a major, major point of conflict. Now, I won't read everything, but were these poor Armenians not martyrs, basically? Suffering like the ones perished under Nero, like basically going to ancient Christianity, and these kind of visions of how we see the world. Now, so what I want to claim here, until now, that these Armenians basically belong to a long historical continuum of Christian suffering. Now, the above testimonies, I think, represent a very small part of an extensive corpus, as I told you, of published and unpublished sources that are in the center of this project. Now, as seen, a whole set of emotions was voiced by the network's members. Perhaps this cluster of emotions was a sign of an emotional turmoil, or maybe they were sometimes expressed in tandem, since if we group them together, I would say, it is quite or possible to acquire certain empathy or sympathy towards one's distressed. In any case, the study of these emotions, I argue, will be crucial in understanding the network's affinity towards the Armenian communities. Furthermore, as I briefly mentioned, the emotional discourse of the network penetrated the public sphere. And this is the most important point for this talk today. It became a dominant theme in the consideration of the British politicians during the last third of the 19th century. Now let me now, and I have 5 minutes more. Less. Let me now conclude or recapitulate about the ideas that I made today, or the notions. Now my lecture today focused on 2 cases that 100 and so years separate them apart, of course. The 2 cases, despite clear differences, of course, they're not the same, I'm not claiming that it's the same, were discussed in order to illustrate the responses of different European communities toward the anguish of other non-Europeans. In both cases, the Christian affinity is a major factor in the response of the European entities. In the first clause, the Dutch case, which is still happening, it was the Dutch Church of Bethel, by the name of the church is Bet El, and they acted for the Tamarzian family. And in the second remote case, it was the Philo-Armenian network that expressed Christian emotionality toward the torment of the Armenians, of course, in Asia Minor. Now, in both cases, through, I would say, emotional Christianity, the victims were upgraded in this hierarchy of suffering. Now, furthermore, in both cases, it was illustrated how emotions of pain, hate, sympathy, and values, Christian affinity, merge and influence the discourse of interests. In both examples, the message is also carried by certain middle sphere networks that operate, certain middle sphere networks that operate in order to bring relief to the suffering victims. In the present day case, it is the pastors or volunteers of the Bethel Church, and in the historical case, of course, it was the member of this Philo-Armenian network. Now, at least concerning, I would say, the historical case, it seems that this middle sphere network, and this is a very important point, failed in its attempt to save the Armenians. The network did manage to influence considerable parts of the public and the political sphere, but eventually, as I told you, Britain, during the last third of the 19th century, failed to rescue the Armenians and chose to preserve certain vested interests of the empire. Now, in the historical Armenians as well, despite the public outcry, there was still a rather clear dichotomy between the realistic dimension, interest, and the moral dimension, in its abstract sense. For this reason, the realistic, I would say, eventually prevailed. However, there are other examples in which the dichotomy, I would say, between the realistic and the idealistic are far less obvious. Just consider, for instance, Angela Merkel's decision to allow around 1 million, mainly Syrian refugees, to settle in Germany. Many argue, I think, wrongly, that based on pure realistic, political, and economic reasoning, Merkel adopted an irrational decision. However, if one takes into consideration the cultural and historical paradigms mentioned in the beginning of my talk, it is rather clear that in the case of Germany's history, Merkel's response was not only emotional, or based, I would say, on values, but was also a strategic act, amalgamated with realistic considerations. Thus, the image and responsibility of a certain state, is also part of the realpolitik. The image is very much important. Now another very recent, I'm only bringing you very recent examples because a lot of things happen in the world just during the last week, but another very recent example of how values and ideas, I would say, influence the realpolitik takes us in a certain extent out of Europe and into Trump's decision to withdraw from Syria. I'm sorry to bring Trump to the table, but this is a very important point. Now in response to this step, we all know that the Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, resigned. Now, in his resignation letter, Mattis wrote the following words, very important letter, by the way. While the US remains the indispensable nation in the free world, we cannot protect our interests or serve this role effectively without maintaining a strong alliances and showing, and this is the main word here, respect to those allies. Respect as a value is part of realpolitik. This is what Mattis says. And when he speaks about respect, he also speaks about the fact that the European partners are still in Syria. We also betray them, not only Israel. This is an important point. Thus, and I conclude with this, in some cases, ideals and emotions play a major role in influencing public opinion and in forging alliances in diplomacy. In practice, they become part of the interests. As for the Tamarzian family, it remains to be seen what their fate will be. However, this example, as well as my main study case of Britain's response towards the Armenian suffering, illustrate how a certain hierarchy of suffering is in fact determined by a composite range of interests, values, and emotions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oded, for this quick overview of so many issues.
Yeah, so I had to do the,
the time was
half an hour for the Armenian
so
questions.
please bear with us, give us the time to ask him questions.
We can stay here until 9.
And I'll take the privilege to ask the first one. I mean, I could not think about Abu Mazen, who yesterday again insisted what he says every year, that Jesus had been Palestinian. So about political appropriation, in fact, of the receiving side. Let's see, how much did the Armenians themselves play the card of saying we are Christians? Because this is rather, I mean, in the one remote... no, but the Armenians themselves tried to play the card of being Christians to get support. Political appropriation of religion, culture, in that context to...
Sorry, I'm embarrassed to say my father is here, he's an expert on Palestinian issues. I did not hear what Abu Mazen says.
No, Abu Mazen likes to say that Jesus was Palestinian.
Oh, okay.
So this is a political appropriation of suffering, saying, I mean, we are in that Christian suffering. I mean, it's even said by...
okay, sorry.
No, and I just brought this as an example. My question is how much political appropriation of Christian heritage, suffering, etc., has been also used by the Armenians to evoke compassion.
Oh, this is a very important point. Of course, the Christian suffering, I would say, is a major issue here. I mean, but one needs to understand, I think, and this is the greatest problem. I mean, I didn't have time to elaborate on this, but the Armenians, although they're Christians, of course, they're following the Apostolic Armenian Church. And I have one of the slides that show basically the church in Israel, in the Holy Sepulchre, basically, the Armenian Holy Sepulchre. So there was a need, basically, to say, no, we belong to the same Christianity. There was a gap there. It wasn't only a geographical, mental gap. There was also a gap in religion. They're not the same Christians. Not only that, it's hard to say, but they were perceived as Asians. This was also a racial discourse. And of course, you saw there's a whole tension, which of course, I mean, I deal a lot with current nationalism and national theories, but there's a whole tension, especially in the 19th century, when I speak about the roots of nationalism, between this discourse of religion, race, and I would say nation. And of course, language also comes into the part. There's a reason why I called my book in that name. I mean, it's about these issues also affecting, I would say, today. I mean, what is religion? How do we define it? Is it based on racial, for instance? Sometimes. I could not elaborate on this. And this is an amazing point they make. They say that I would say, let's say it this way, there is a dependent and independent factor. For some of these people, the independent factor is basically religion, not race. So basically what happens is that religion determines or determines racial affinities. So if one is Christian, like the Hungarians, despite a certain racial, the Hungarians, as they saw them, are belonging to the Turks. It's a whole Turkish. They should be there with that word. No, but because they adopted Christianity, they became part of the Aryan Christianity. And this is how these people perceive the world. Also regarding the Armenians. And what worked for them is that they adopted, as you all know, Christianity, one of the first nations or entities to adopt Christianity, 301 AD. That's when they took Christianity on. So this plays a major part. But because of this difference between this Christianity and that Christianity, there is a gap there. But still, it's not a great gap. Once you use discourse of civilization, I would say clashing of civilizations, then the British public was on board, basically. I can elaborate more and more on Russia and so on, but yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's hard not to relate both of your lectures, although they are so different from each other. And in a certain way, it seems that part of what you presented today is also kind of the flip side of what we heard before. So the other side of Europe. You emphasized the hierarchy of suffering and things like that, but people argue, and I think you also made this point, that the Armenian genocide and the response in Europe to it was also the birth of what was later coined humanitarianism, and which became then in the 70s really, first outside of the parliaments, really a particular force, which then was adopted, especially in Europe, as a core essential element of foreign policy, and which is now contested by exactly these kind of populist new players. And of course, therefore, it's interesting that today, although they are in favor of the Christian, Judean Christian, whatever, they are in many cases, especially in Western Europe, opposing the politics the Christian churches are doing, because the Christian churches, as you rightly demonstrate, are very much informed by this humanitarian paradigm. So my question is, how far does this kind of humanitarianism plays into this, and can one make the case that this was an important moment for that? And the second thing, because you mentioned it but did not really elaborate more, how far did these questions of images, public events, and so on played a role? Because I also heard that the Armenian genocide was for the first time, was the birth of kind of creating public events and using photographs and images in order to make the case for the suffering of the Armenians.
Thank you.
Shall we collect, maybe?
Okay.
James.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious if you noticed any other examples, any specific or relevant distinctions between Catholic churches and Protestant churches. I couldn't help but think about the takeover of the votive church in Vienna as an example where in this case a large group of mostly Muslim migrants took over, barricaded themselves inside a Catholic church and refused to vacate, actually made demands of the government in Vienna. And you had a Catholic charity organization, I think it was the Caritas, which for weeks provided food, clothes, and whatnot.
Yeah, you mean doing the recent process? Yeah.
Yes.
Some more questions, and then otherwise.
Okay, so starting with humanitarianism. So I'm a historian as well. I'm researching nationalism. It's my new research project as well. I didn't tell you it's about comparative nationalism with Chaim Gantz in Tel Aviv. So I'm working on that as well. But if I go back to my historical perspective, this goes back to the anti-slave discourse. So I would say this is the main turning point, especially in British history. Not only British, by the way. So this humanitarian religious discourse, I would call it proto-humanitarian discourse, because this is not exactly humanitarian. The main thing is the religion. They will not usually help other dominions or religions. That's an important point to make. But the slavery, this kind of discourse comes up there. They took on Christianity. They are part of us. we need to have them. Of course, in Britain, they abolished slavery in the beginning of the 19th century. And then it goes also to this kind of discourse about this kind of networks. This is only one sort of network, a Philo-Armenian network, based in Britain, has transnational roots and so on. But it's only one network. All around Europe, there's networks like this, in Russia, France, and so on. So there's parallels and so on. I mean, my project, as I see it, will basically trace this kind of humanitarian, on map, digital humanities, if you want, on map, to see where this kind of discourse went, where the letters sent to, who was based there, who was based there. This also, now if you go further on in history, Michel Toussaint, Stefan Ehrig, for instance, two people that wrote on the Armenian question, one in Britain, one in Germany, both of them imply to this kind of proto-humanitarian discourse. The thing is there, and I think this is the uniqueness maybe of what I'm trying to show or elaborate on, is this is coming from a middle sphere. It's not about diplomatics, it's not about high politics, this is about people working on the ground for a certain Christian affinity. This is the base, of course, for humanitarian acts. And you're right, and I think if I refer to the book, a very major book, there's multiple editions, about Activists Without Borders, by Keck. Yeah. There, they start from the slavery precedent, I would say, but go all the way from the last 30 years. And then you see that it's about this kind of a discourse, Foucaultian discourse, if you want, a closed one, which they develop. And this network, they speak in the same language. And it's astonishing, I think, to see that this discourse of religious and humanitarian opinions is basically being fused by people from different backgrounds altogether. And this is what maybe humanitarian did. It basically grouped together people who are not being grouped together beforehand. And this is why I think it's so relevant to today. I mean, of course you can claim, okay, they're all Europeans, these pastors, volunteers in the Tamarzian incident in going now. No. Protestant, Catholic, differences to answer also James's question still play a certain role here. But I think in this case, people came also because of humanitarian acts. So in the interviews, I went through all the interviews of people being interviewed in this church, going on now. Half of them, at least, in the interviews in the newspaper, said, we're not coming here for religious reasons. It's not about religion. It's about the way we feel for these suffering families or refugees. The church is the excuse. Okay, so this is a flip. If I show that the first incident was because of religion, they support them, now I would say it's sort of. It's not binary, it's not this or that. But I mean, half of the people, all volunteers, they take on this view that we come here for humanitarian reasons. That's what we want to support, the Tamarzian family and so on. James, Catholic, Protestant and so on. Well, this is a big question. If I go back to England, even Germany in a sense, this Catholic Protestant split, especially in the 19th century, has a great impact. I mean, in England, for instance, you can see it broad church, high church, and what you call even ones who are, I would say, going over the border to Catholicism. Most of these people, and this is a very important point, were Protestant or Anglican. So there is a certain kind of, I would say, pan-Protestant action here. But again, because they need to imagine the Armenians who have a total Oriental Christianity, you can say, Ethiopian one, I mean, more related to that churches, they need to imagine and they need to make it a far bigger case for Christianity. If they take a discourse which is limited, no, it won't work. This is for the past. As for today, and I think the answer to Tobias also referred to this, yes, people came from an attitude that they need to help the Christian. I don't think they really care about a certain kind of, if we're Protestants or Catholics, no. As you see, the Pope every week or so, I mean, he speaks for the refugees and so on. I mean, you can criticize or not criticize him or whatever, but he speaks for them as the representative of the Catholic Church. He has a saying on that. But he's also an image of saying, and of course today, once, and this is a very important point, they understood, I think, and this is a point that needs to be elaborated, if the populist movements are moving because of a certain kind of xenophobia, how do you move people from a different direction? And one of the answers is, of course, religion or emotions, an emotional discourse. It's going down a layer in order to go down from the real politics of the old politicians and so on in order to give an alternative. And I think this is a very good alternative, by the way, against such populist movements. Geert Wilders, for instance, is not in coalition now. I mean, this discourse and the government, the Dutch government, is being under great pressure. And they need to, here they see suddenly people are supporting us because, or supporting the church, sorry, because of this kind of agency. They're really trying to influence through Christianity a certain reality.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. If you have more questions, he's been willing to stay here for another few hours, I guess.
I've been in the university for the last, I don't know, it's 18 years. So.